Welcome again to our study of the characters of the Bible. We're in the Old Testament, and when we think about the patriarchs of Israel, the names of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob stand out in our studies and in our memories, but too often we don't include Joseph. And since he was not one of those that we will label as a patriarch, he, like Moses, becomes a dominant factor in the history of Israel in Egypt and the process of getting them out of Egypt with the blessing of Joseph's experience in Egypt. First, like David, Joseph was the child of Jacob's old age and the son of Rachel, as was his younger brother Benjamin. And these two were his beloved sons, but Joseph was his favorite. You would think that Jacob would have learned with his experiences with Isaac and Rebekah that playing favorites in the family is always going to bring conflict. But Jacob didn't learn. He gave his son Joseph a coat of many colors. It's an example of making that child royalty as compared to others who had a nice robe, but not anywhere near the kind of color and symbolism that came in the gift that Jacob gave to Joseph. So his brothers resented it. And then Joseph was a dreamer. As a teenager, he had some great imagination of what might happen to him later in his life. He unfortunately told his brothers about the dreams, and they resented him even more because of what the dreams apparently meant when Joseph himself interpreted those dreams for his brothers. They despised the way he saw them, and his dreams were obviously offensive to his brothers. They decided that they would kill him. They put him down in a pit, and both Reuben and Simeon, two of his older brothers, had plans to get him out of the pit and take him home to his father. But in the process of leaving Joseph in the pit, a caravan of Ishmaelites, slave traders, came through that area, and they decided, this is a good thing, we're going to sell Joseph. And so they did, for 20 pieces of silver. I don't know how they divided that up or what they told their father about how they got that money, but when it came time for the father to come and visit them where they were herding the sheep, Joseph's coat was still available. So they took a sheep, slaughtered it, and spread the blood around on Joseph's coat. And Jacob was the one who identified the coat and then the blood that was there and decided that his son was dead. So the boys protected themselves from having to lie to Jacob, even though they knew that what he saw would convince him that Joseph was dead. Well, that moves Joseph from Canaan to Egypt. And when the Ishmaelites got him to Egypt, they sold him to a man named Potiphar. Potiphar was apparently one of the lesser rulers in Pharaoh's court. And Potiphar was probably an older man, and he married perhaps several women. One of them was a younger wife, and she was enamored of Joseph, and so she tried to seduce him. Joseph was smart enough to avoid that situation as long as he could, but she grabbed him one time, and he left his coat in her hand and ran out of the house, and then she lied about him as well and said he tried to attack me. Well, Joseph wound up then not just in a pit, in Canaan or in slavery in Potiphar's house. Now he winds up in the prison. Sometimes when you think you're doing God's will and you're asking for God's blessing in your life, the way he chooses to reveal himself to you and to work his blessings in your life surprises you. You don't want to be ridiculed by your brothers. You don't want to be left in a pit. You don't want to be sold into slavery. You don't want to be attempted to be seduced and then to be blamed for it and lied about so that you wind up in prison. But something happened in the life of Joseph in this process that he held on to his integrity and he relied on his faith in God. So in spite of the fact that he was in the prison and now two inmates show up with him, the butler and the baker from Pharaoh's court, and they have dreams. So Joseph interprets their dreams and tells them what they mean. One, a very happy dream about being restored to his previous position. The other, sad dream about his life being taken from him. But when the fortunate dreamer was restored, although he was very happy about being back in Pharaoh's court, he forgot about Joseph. So there are times in your life and mine when we do good things for people and they forget about them. They forget that we need their help and assistance at times too. Joseph suffered in prison a little longer. But then the story takes an interesting twist. Pharaoh has a dream. And nobody in Pharaoh's court, even though there were many magicians and sorcerers around Pharaoh, nobody could interpret the dream in a way that would satisfy Pharaoh. And about that time, the man who had been restored to his position told Pharaoh there was somebody in prison who could interpret his dream. And you remember the story. Joseph was brought in, and Joseph was smart enough at that point to say, I'm not going to be the one who's going to interpret your dream, but the Lord himself will give us the answer to your dream. Well, it turned out that Joseph's dream, Joseph's interpretation of the dream, and the 7 years of plenty that were coming in Egypt, and the 7 years of famine that were going to follow, was exactly what Pharaoh wanted to learn in this process. So he decided Joseph was a godlike man and had great powers. Joseph may not have appreciated being treated in that way, but again, he relied on his faith and he became the second in command in Egypt. And Pharaoh used him to store grain for the 7 good years that were coming and the 7 fatted calves that were in the dream. And then they had food to carry them through the 7 lean or 7 emaciated calves in the other part of the dream that Joseph had interpreted for Pharaoh. What an amazing story, this amazing character in the life of the Old Testament. You couldn't make this up. Only God could reveal these kinds of things in his history of blessing a man like Joseph. Well, the famine touched Canaan as well as Egypt, and it touched all the other nations around Egypt, and Egypt was the only place that other folks could come and buy grain to get them through this famine. Who should come from Canaan to buy grain? Joseph's brothers. And it was a time when Joseph could have taken vengeance on his brothers, but he chose not to do that. He did not reveal himself to his brothers initially, but he had this faith that is revealed in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, when he says, "You meant it to me for evil, but God meant it to me for good." Have you noticed how many principles in the Old and New Testament stand out when we trust God and follow Him? Paul said it this way: we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose. So Joseph prematurely, with the words from Paul, began to see that God works all things for good in his life. He sends his brothers back, and they're amazed when they stop for the rest period that their money is inside the sack again. And now, when they are afraid to go back to Egypt to buy more grain, it's run out in their home in Canaan, they remember that this man, they refer to him as, said, "Don't you dare come back to Egypt unless you bring your younger brother. I'm not even sure your father's alive." Joseph taunted him a little bit. So they told Jacob, "We've got to take Benjamin with us." Jacob was pierced in his heart because he had lost his beloved son Joseph, and now he might lose his beloved child Benjamin. The story goes on, and you remember that finally the brothers come back, they bring Benjamin, and Jacob eventually comes himself, and Joseph is able to reveal himself to his brothers. And Pharaoh is so enamored with Joseph and the things he's done for the nation, he allows Joseph to pick out a spot for his family to settle. And he picks out the land of Goshen, north of where Pharaoh's temple cities were built. There, where flocks and herds could thrive and where the people could grow together, Joseph and all of those who were descendants of Jacob formed a great nation. Interestingly, when you come to the Old Testament and the promise to Abraham, "I'll make you a great nation and I'm going to give you a land," Jacob had to go to Egypt until his followers became a great nation, and God fulfilled part of the covenant to Abraham. Don't push God when He doesn't bring things about now in your life. Joseph is a good example of how God takes bad things that happen to good people and turns them into blessings and strengths in their lives. And I hope you'll discover that and experience that along with Joseph. As you read on about Joseph in the book of Genesis and then into the book of Exodus, which introduces Moses as the character to follow him, you get this principle repeated. What you meant for me, what you meant for evil for me, God meant it for good. But after a while, when Jacob had died and Joseph himself was near death, and they both asked to be carried back to Canaan, and many of the people from Pharaoh's court, as well as those who wanted to travel back for the burial, went with the body of Jacob. And eventually, when the people returned to Canaan, Joseph himself was taken back, this time embalmed and in a coffin, which was the way the Egyptians did it. But the scripture says a new king arose in Egypt, and this king did not know Joseph. There's a lesson here for us. Sometimes when you think God has done great things, and I bless him, I praise him for how he's used something in my life or in the lives of my friends. But there arises new power sources in our lives who've forgotten that God blessed us in certain ways. So it was with Joseph. So Pharaoh forgot Joseph, and that led into the depression of the people, into their punishment, into their miserable slavery in the land of Egypt. And there are A few things that we ought to remember about Joseph in summarizing this lesson. First of all, dreams shared with others may bring hostile reactions rather than positive results for us in our lives. Not everybody is going to appreciate your dream and your vision. But if God gives it to you, don't lose it. Continue to pursue it and allow Him to make that happen in your life. Another principle that we see in the life of Joseph is that jealousy can create anger and murderous responses. If it hadn't been for the discovery of the Ishmaelites going along the route to Egypt, Joseph's brothers might have killed him and tried to pull it off to their father Jacob. But Joseph was spared death at the hands of his brothers, and in spite of their hostile reactions, he was allowed to let his dream be fulfilled. When he got to Egypt, there's another lesson that comes to us, and that's this lesson. Spiritual pride can create temptations and even imprisonment when we are not careful of all those that are around us and we teach them to trust God in the way we trust God. Joseph had some real tests for the integrity of his faith, and that experience with Potiphar's wife was certainly one of them. And the last lesson I want to mention this morning is that no matter how much you've helped someone with his dreams or helping to bring about change in his life in the past, he may not remember you with gratitude, only with forgetfulness. Joseph had that experience with the butler. He had that experience with the baker, who both forgot him when they were returned to Pharaoh's court. Then he had the experience, after doing great things for Egypt, of having a new king arise who did not know him and what God had done through him. Don't become discouraged if people don't get on your bandwagon, pat you on the back, and say, you've done a great job. What really matters is that God knows what you've done, and what others may intend for evil in your life, He will bring good. I'm reminded of this story here at the end of this lesson of Teddy Roosevelt, when he was president of the United States, going to Africa and hunting wild game. And it was a kind of thing that was written up in the newspapers. And when Roosevelt was returning home on a ship and coming into New York Harbor, there were all sorts of people gathered on the docks waiting to cheer him home. And they were all waving and saying, "Welcome home." And Roosevelt and his entourage got off the ship. But standing on the next level up was a missionary and his wife who had served in Africa for 40 years and were coming home now to retirement. The missionary was crushed. In his heart, he was disappointed that people would welcome the president home, but no one was there to welcome him. And so when he and his wife got off the gangplank and stood there on the dock, there was no one there to say, "Welcome home, servant of God." And in those moments, God spoke to him and He said, "Son, Roosevelt's home now, but you're not home now. Whatever's going on in your life, remember God is the one who is going to judge it. He's the one who's going to reward it. And someday, He's going to say, 'Son, welcome home.' May it be true for you today and for me."